October 6, 2025. The headlines screamed Ukraine. The screens glowed Gaza. The world's attention was fixed thousands of miles away on two wars that seemed to define our era. But while everyone was watching the Middle East and Eastern Europe, something extraordinary and almost invisible unfolded on the Atlantic coast of Africa. Moscow made a move, not with tanks, not with threats, but with a pen. That morning, the Russian parliament quietly approved a military partnership with one of West Africa's smallest nations, Togo. A country most analysts never talk about, a country with a population smaller than New York City, but a coastline that could change the balance of power in the entire region. What makes this deal so important isn't just military cooperation. It's geography and timing, because 3 days earlier, Togo signed another pact, this time with the Alliance of Sahel States, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. These are nations rich in gold, uranium, and resolve but landlocked. They've spent decades trapped in economic systems designed by others. Now, for the first time, they've found a way to reach the Atlantic on their own terms. While Western media debates ceasefires and sanctions, a new corridor of power is opening quietly in Africa, one that connects Russian warships Sahel minerals and the deep waters of Lomé's port. It's not just a trade route. It's a message the post-colonial map is being redrawn. So what happens when a small coastal nation becomes the new gateway for a continent and Moscow's next outpost on the Atlantic? And how will this shape the future of countries like Nigeria, long seen as the big brother of West Africa? Stay with us, because this isn't just another regional story. This could be the most important shift you never heard about until now. Subscribe if you believe the truth deserves a spotlight even when the world isn't watching. The story begins in Lomé, the capital of Togo, a coastal city of fewer than 2 million people, but home to one of Africa's busiest ports. On October 6, 2025, Russia and Togo signed a military cooperation agreement that stunned analysts who had been watching Ukraine, not West Africa. The deal wasn't a secret for long. It was approved by Russia's State Duma, formalizing Moscow's access to Togolese ports and waters, including permission for Russian warships to dock, train, and operate along the Atlantic coast. For a nation like Togo, this wasn't a random alliance. It was a masterstroke. The port of Lomé already handled over 300 million tons of cargo in 2024, according to the World Bank, making it one of the few deep-water ports in the region capable of accommodating large international vessels 24 hours a day. For Russia, which lost several footholds in Africa after the collapse of Wagner operations, this was the perfect entry point into the Atlantic, a way to secure influence not by invasion, but by invitation. The agreement covers more than just security. It includes joint training equipment, sharing navigation, hydrography, and maritime intelligence, all critical elements that hint at a long-term military and logistical partnership. But what made the move truly extraordinary was its timing. Because just 3 days earlier, Togo had signed another deal, one that could reshape the entire economic map of West Africa. On October 3, 2025, Togo joined hands with the Alliance of Sahel States, AES, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso in a historic customs integration pact. For decades, these landlocked nations had no direct path to the sea. Their gold, uranium, and agricultural exports had to pass through trade routes controlled by coastal countries still tied to former colonial systems. That meant taxes, red tape, and dependency. This new deal changed everything. By linking their customs systems directly to the port of Lomé through digital infrastructure, these countries created their own independent corridor to the Atlantic. No more French oversight. No more ECOWAS bureaucracy. Goods could now flow directly from Ouagadougou or Niamey to the docks of Lomé in half the time at half the cost. The numbers tell the story. It costs roughly $4,800 to move a 40-foot container through Nigeria's Lagos port. In Lomé, that same shipment costs about $1,500. In Lagos, containers sit an average of 14 days before clearance. In Lomé, only 4 days. That difference doesn't just affect profits, it rewrites trade routes. Shipping giants like Mediterranean shipping company MSC have already rerouted vessels to Lomé to avoid Nigeria's congestion, and Togo's government knows exactly what it's doing. President Faure Gnassingbé, who has ruled for over 2 decades, is quietly repositioning his nation. With France withdrawing troops from West Africa after 65 years, a power vacuum emerged and Lomé stepped into it. Instead of relying on Paris, Nassim Bey looked east toward Moscow to diversify partners and reclaim leverage. For the Sahel countries, the timing couldn't have been better. Leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré of Burkina Faso had long spoken of building economic sovereignty, ending dependence on French banks and Western-controlled routes. Through this customs deal, Traoré's vision suddenly found a coastline. The result is a convergence of interests. Russia gains a strategic naval foothold on the Atlantic. Togo becomes a key logistics hub and earns global relevance. The Sahel Alliance gets direct sea access for its vast mineral wealth. In less than 1 week, a quiet sequence of signatures, October 3rd and October 6th, achieved what decades of African diplomacy could not: a united trade and defense corridor independent of Western oversight. The world might not have noticed, but in the streets of Lomé you could feel it. Port workers spoke with pride. Local newspapers printed headlines calling it a new era for Togo. And for the first time, the small nation on the Atlantic coast wasn't just shipping goods, it was shipping power. For decades, the Sahel nations, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, were treated like the inland poor cousins of Africa's coastal economies. Their borders trapped them, their resources exported through colonial trade corridors, their sovereignty clipped by geography. But in October 2025, that began to change. The customs pact between Togo and the Sahel Alliance was more than a bureaucratic reform. It was a declaration of independence. For the first time in living memory, these nations could send their gold, uranium, and cotton directly to the Atlantic without passing through the colonial filters of ECOWAS or French-controlled routes. When the news broke, Sahel leaders didn't celebrate with fireworks. They spoke with the quiet pride of men who knew history was turning. Burkina Faso's Captain Ibrahim Traoré called it a gateway built not by foreign hands, but by African will. Mali's Prime Minister Abdoulaye Maïga added, "The road to sovereignty is full of obstacles, but together we clear them one by one." The mood in Lomé, however, was electric. The port workers knew the significance instantly. Overnight, they weren't just loading ships, they were rewriting maps. Truck convoys began lining the new inland corridors, heading north toward Ouagadougou and Niamey. Logistics companies started recruiting French-speaking technicians from across the Sahel. Even the World Bank released a memo noting that increased efficiency in Togo's port systems is driving structural shifts in West African trade patterns. Then came the second half of the story, the Russian connection. With the ink barely dry on the customs pact, Moscow sent a delegation led by Ambassador Igor Evdokimov and defense official Vladimir Gusiev to finalize the military cooperation framework. Within days, the State Duma ratified it, making the arrangement official. Russian naval vessels would now have open access to the port of Lomé for training, refueling, and logistics. For Moscow, it was a strategic victory. After the disbandment of the Wagner Group, Russia had been searching for a legitimate replacement for its African influence. The newly established African Corps, now under direct control of the Kremlin, needed access points across the continent. Lomé offered what no other West African nation could: a deep-water Atlantic port outside Western military influence. In essence, Russia just secured a gateway to the Atlantic Ocean, directly connecting its Sahel partners to global trade routes. For Western analysts, it was a geopolitical earthquake. The reaction was immediate. In Abuja, Nigerian officials convened emergency meetings. Foreign Minister Yusuf Tuggar warned publicly that foreign militarization near Nigeria's borders risks destabilizing regional security. Nigeria, long the economic powerhouse of West Africa, suddenly found itself boxed in its northern neighbors allied with Moscow, its western flank now hosting Russian vessels, and its own ports losing business to Lomé. Meanwhile, in Ghana, phone lines lit up between Accra and Washington. The U.S. ambassador urged calm, but also promised strategic coordination. Within weeks, Ghana reopened talks for expanded U.S. defense cooperation, including drone monitoring over the Gulf of Guinea. The timing was no coincidence. And then came the most symbolic gesture. On July 2025, months before the deal was public, the U.S. diplomat Richard Michaels paid a highly publicized visit to the port of Lomé, praising it as a gateway to Africa's future markets. In hindsight, that visit wasn't diplomacy, it was reconnaissance. By late October, whispers spread across the region. ECOWAS, once the proud symbol of regional unity, was fracturing. Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso had already left. Now, a poll in Togo showed 54% of citizens favored doing the same, joining the Sahel Alliance and its Russian partners. The map of alliances was shifting in real time. This was the climax, not a battle, not a coup, but a peaceful reordering of African power. In just 1 week, the chain of events, October 3rd's customs pact and October 6th's military deal, had torn apart 60 years of Western economic dominance. At Lomé's port, Russian engineers and Togolese officers stood side by side overlooking cranes loading cargo bound for the Sahel. In their reflections, one could almost see the past fading and the future docking quietly at the pier. By late October 2025, the ripples of the Russia-Togo alliance and the Sahel customs revolution were no longer ripples. They were waves reshaping the entire coastline of West Africa. What began as a quiet trade agreement and a handshake in Lomé was now a full-blown geopolitical reordering. The most immediate impact was economic, but beneath the numbers lay something far more profound, a cultural and political awakening. In Nigeria, the economic giant that once set the tone for the region, alarm bells were ringing. For decades, Lagos had served as the beating heart of West African commerce, but the new trade corridor through Togo was bleeding it dry. According to data from Nigeria's own customs authority, export values to Togo had skyrocketed sixfold, not because of increased trade, but because shippers were rerouting cargo to Lomé to escape Lagos's bureaucracy and corruption. Each container that bypassed Lagos meant lost customs duties, lost taxes, and lost jobs. Analysts estimated that hundreds of billions of naira could vanish from Nigeria's annual revenue stream. Local dock workers in Apapa began protesting over idle shifts. Freight companies started moving their headquarters westward to Lomé. A frustrated Nigerian port official was quoted anonymously saying, "We are watching our own trade slip away one ship at a time." But the consequences weren't only financial, they were psychological. For the first time, smaller nations, the ones long dismissed as dependent, were setting the pace. The Sahel Alliance, once landlocked and sidelined, now had a route to the ocean and a partnership that didn't run through Paris or Washington. The emotional shift across the Sahel was undeniable. In Ouagadougou, young students carried posters of Captain Ibrahim Traoré reading "Our Resources, Our Road." Radio hosts in Bamako debated how the new system could one day lead to a shared Sahelian currency, independent of the CFA franc that tied them to France for generations. In Togo, optimism was palpable. Local business owners began expanding warehouses and logistics companies scrambled to hire new drivers. Even small fishing villages near Lomé started to see indirect benefits, better roads, new trade activity, and more jobs. For a country of only 8 million, the deal represented a leap in national pride. Lomé was no longer just a port, it was a symbol of sovereignty. Yet beneath the optimism, unease brewed. The prospect of Russian warships operating just 200 kilometers from Lagos raised fears of a militarized coastline. Western diplomats whispered of a creeping shadow of Moscow spreading across the Gulf of Guinea. The ECOWAS bloc, once envisioned as Africa's model of unity, was now fractured beyond repair. 3 members gone, 1 wavering, and the rest divided between loyalty to the West and admiration for the new order. This fragmentation spilled into the political arena. Ghana, long a voice of moderation, now faced pressure to pick a side. Civil society groups demanded transparency about its growing defense talks with the U.S. In Nigeria, lawmakers clashed over how to respond, whether to confront the Sahel alliance diplomatically or attempt to reclaim lost trade influence by modernizing their ports. Meanwhile, a new vocabulary entered African political discourse: sovereignty, multipolarity, independence through trade. These were no longer slogans for conferences, they were becoming policy. For the ordinary African citizen, the change was visible yet uncertain. Roads were busier, ports were expanding, and the air was thick with both excitement and apprehension. The question hanging over every conversation was simple but profound: are we finally free? Or are we walking into another empire just painted in different colors? In the streets of Lomé, that question echoed like a prophecy, one that would shape not only the nation's future, but the destiny of an entire continent. From Washington to Brussels, the Togo-Russia alliance landed like a geopolitical thunderclap that few saw coming. For the first time since the end of the Cold War, Moscow had gained not just access but legitimacy on the Atlantic coast of Africa. And it did so, not with soldiers, but with spreadsheets, cranes, and shipping manifests. In Washington, analysts at the Pentagon and State Department began redrawing their maps of Africa. For years, U.S. strategy had been clear: maintain stability through ECOWAS counterterrorism in the Sahel and Project Soft Power through aid and training. But suddenly, the narrative flipped. The United States woke up to find that the institutions it once backed, ECOWAS, the CFA franc system, and even the regional trade corridors were collapsing under their own colonial weight. The visit of Ambassador Richard Michaels to Lomé months earlier now looked prophetic. His warm handshake at the port, captured in a photo that later trended online, was Washington's quiet admission that it had underestimated the scale of Moscow's play. The U.S. response, at least for now, was diplomatic containment. Ghana and Senegal were offered new defense cooperation packages. American advisors returned to Accra and Abidjan, promising to modernize local port infrastructure. But inside the Beltway, policymakers whispered a harder truth. Africa is no longer the backyard, it's the new front line. Across the Atlantic, Europe faced a different kind of reckoning. For France, it was humiliation dressed as history. After pulling its troops out of Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, Paris found itself watching its former colonies align with Russia, the very power it once warned them against. French newspapers called it the Sahel divorce. Economic analysts in Brussels noted that French corporations were already losing millions in logistics and energy contracts. The European Union, distracted by Ukraine and internal crises, struggled to respond beyond expressions of concern. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the tone was triumphant, but measured. Russian state media framed the deal as a victory for African self-determination, a message carefully designed to resonate across the global south. The African Corps, now under direct Kremlin supervision, became a tool of influence, offering training, technology, and trade routes, a soft power model wrapped in hard steel. For the first time in modern history, Russia had a presence on both sides of the African continent, the Red Sea through Sudan, and now the Atlantic through Togo. China, quietly observing, saw opportunity. Beijing's Belt and Road partners in Africa were already integrating with the new corridor. Chinese engineering firms began bidding for contracts to expand Lomé's inland rail network toward Niamey and Ouagadougou. Unlike the West, China didn't see the Togo-Russia pact as competition, it saw it as an invitation to embed deeper. And so the world's great powers began orbiting around a small West African nation that most people still couldn't find on a map. The irony was painful. While global media obsessed over Europe's borders, the future of global trade and power projection was being rewritten on Africa's western shore. For America, the question wasn't just how to counter Russia. It was deeper, almost moral. Could Washington still claim to support African sovereignty while defending a system built on old dependencies? Or was it time finally to listen to nations like Burkina Faso and Togo, who were saying, "We want partnership, not permission"? That question still hangs in the air, not only in the corridors of power, but in the conscience of a world learning once again that the sun may be setting on the old order and rising quietly over Africa. By the end of 2025, the world map no longer looked the same, not in borders, but in meaning. The names hadn't changed, but the balance behind them had. From Lomé's shimmering coastline to the sun-scorched plains of the Sahel, Africa had quietly redrawn its destiny. What began as two quiet agreements, one on customs, one on defense, had evolved into a movement. The Alliance of Sahel States, once seen as a desperate coalition of isolated nations, was now a model of defiance. The message resonated far beyond West Africa: if sovereignty is real, it must be built, not borrowed. For leaders like Captain Ibrahim Traoré, this was never just about trade or military power. It was about dignity, the ability to look one's people in the eye and say, "We control what is ours." His words echoing across the region stirred something long dormant belief, a belief that Africa could stand tall without leaning on Paris, Washington, or Beijing. But with every new dawn comes a shadow. History has shown that no power cedes influence quietly. What happens when the old order, bruised but not broken, strikes back? When economic pressure, covert destabilization, or political manipulation return under new names and faces? The West may call it aid, others may call it partnership. But for Africans, the question remains, is it freedom or just a different kind of chain? Across the ocean, in living rooms from Atlanta to Boston, Americans who once saw Africa as a distant story are beginning to ask new questions. How much of our own comfort depends on systems that keep others down? And what if the next century's moral reckoning isn't about war or climate, but about who gets to decide their own future? Because the truth is, this isn't just Africa's story, it's humanity's reflection. When nations once written off as poor and unstable begin rewriting the rules, it challenges every assumption we've built our world upon. So as Russia's flag flutters over Lomé's port, and as Burkina Faso's young president walks among his people unguarded and unafraid, a new chapter is being written, one that the mainstream headlines will only catch years too late. And maybe the real question for all of us is this: will we watch it happen from afar, or will we finally listen? If you've made it this far, you're already part of a rare conversation, one that values truth over spin and courage over comfort. Please share this video if you believe that Africa deserves the right to choose its own path, free, proud, and united. Subscribe if you believe that the truth still matters, even when the world isn't watching.